Hello and welcome to the Center for Independent Studies. I'm Salvatore Babones, and tonight I'll be asking, does Hong Kong have a future? Joining me tonight are two business people who have their fingers in the pulse of Asia. Simon Littlewood of management consultancy ACG Global and Daniel Del Rey of strategic communications firm Kekst CNC. Daniel, Simon, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight at the Center for Independent Studies.
Thank you, Salvatore. Pleasure to be here.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's a great pleasure to meet you, Daniel.
The pleasure is all ours. Daniel, you're on the ground there in Hong Kong advising clients on how to handle corporate communications when, in theory, even one errant tweet can see someone imprisoned for sedition. What are you telling your clients about how to handle that situation?
Well, Salvatore, let me start off by providing a very direct answer to the question, does Hong Kong have a future? I think that it does. I think we are seeing that certainly the business community here is becoming somewhat more comfortable with conditions on the ground. In terms of what I'm telling clients, certainly at the outset when the national security law was first implemented, we were saying, look, you needn't become overly concerned, but don't do anything that would make you the test case for how this law is implemented. Be very careful, of course, in what you are saying publicly. Be very careful, of course, in what you are saying privately within your offices. But certainly you don't want to be the first person to put this law to the test, to see whether and how the courts are going to adjudicate issues on this matter, or the policy offices that the PRC has here in Hong Kong. However, it's been several months since the law has gone into implementation, and what we've seen is that there has not been I would say, at least within the business community, the draconian level of enforcement that one could have feared had they taken their fears to the illogical extreme. I think the clear and express purpose of the law was to quell unrest, and regardless of your view on the law, it seems to have had that effect. And I think it has created a clear space within which the business community can continue to operate.
Right. I mean, Simon, you run a consultancy that helps clients manage their cash flows in China. Now, I'm assuming Hong Kong is a big hub for that. How does the new security law affect those kinds of operations?
Well, Hong Kong is and isn't a big hub, because it used to be true 20 or 30 years ago that if you wanted to have smooth cash flow with business in China, Hong Kong enjoyed a special status. And by setting up in Hong Kong, you could move money in and out of China much more easily than you could, say, if you're in Singapore or other parts of the world. That ceased to be the case quite a long time ago. Hong Kong does not have a special status from that perspective. You're in effect having to obey the same laws, which has led, of course, to many, many businesses now having a presence on the ground in China, which is perfectly logical. I completely agree with Daniel. Hong Kong does have a future. It just has a very different one.
What is that different future? I mean, let me push you on that. And Simon, let me ask you first, what is that new future for Hong Kong? And then we'll get Daniel to answer that same question.
As you know, I'm a historian, so, the 147 years of colonial Hong Kong is but a drop in the ocean for a classicist like myself. But if you like, Hong Kong used to be a route into China when London was the world's biggest financial center. Now, Hong Kong is going to be a route into the world from China, and is going to be China's biggest financial center. So it's a complete and very interesting inversion. But there's no way that the Chinese are not going to take advantage. There's a positive way to look at the pressures that they're putting in Hong Kong, which is they're trying to turn it into a stable financial center because they recognize the unique expertise that sits there that does not sit in any other Chinese city. They want to make sure that they can use that to raise capital to do business with the outside world, but they don't want the place burning down every 5 minutes. So that's what's behind what's going on at the moment. It's positive in terms of Hong Kong's longer-term growth trajectory. Yeah.
Well, now I know you're not saying it's positive for human rights. You're saying it's positive for the growth trajectory. Daniel, what do you think? I mean, is it positive for the economy in Hong Kong?
Well, I think the historical strengths of Hong Kong continue to be very, very strong, very, very competitive. I don't think anything has happened that poses an existential threat to those strengths. Certainly, this continues to be a hub for business activity because of the legal system here that is very familiar. It's based on the British common law system, and it certainly has the financial infrastructure that is very difficult to replicate elsewhere in Asia, especially if you want access to mainland China. If you're asking me what's what the future will be, what the future looks like, it does look like it's becoming far more integrated with mainland China from a financial and commercial perspective. I mean, what we have seen here, and I may be overly focused on the financial markets just by dint of my profession, but we have seen certainly no shortage of initial public offerings on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange.
Really?
They are, believe they are almost entirely from mainland China, but they are companies with significant valuations. We have seen some of the Chinese tech darlings, some very large companies with multi-billion-dollar market caps, and listings in the United States, either seek a secondary listing here or flirt with making Hong Kong their primary listing venue. Lawyers and bankers I know are incredibly active, and there is, of course, the uncertainty about social and political conditions here, but from a business perspective, things seem to be moving along somewhat unencumbered by a lot of concerns that we had earlier in the year.
Right. So Daniel, let me push you a little further on this, because I know you work with a lot of clients right there in Hong Kong itself. What you're saying seems to confirm what Simon said, which is that Chinese businesses are taking advantage of Hong Kong. But will Hong Kongers want to stay under the circumstances that the new security law has put in place, or will they be fleeing to other parts of East Asia?
Well, I think that's still a mixed picture. So just anecdotally speaking, I have not seen the exodus of Hong Kongers yet, although it is certainly a topic that comes up in many conversations. It seems that the most likely destination may be the United Kingdom, thanks to the BNO, the British National Overseas Passport, and the policy that the government has opened up to provide a pathway to citizenship. A lot of people are, at least the BNO holders that I've spoken to, are seriously considering taking advantage of that. But I mentioned earlier that I do have some statistics on public sentiment here. My company conducted a poll of 1,000 people here in Hong Kong. That was roughly, just to give you some backgrounds, roughly 53% female, 47% male. And most of these people were in their prime earning years, either starting their career or some level of experience. About 3/4 of them were between the ages of 25 and 54. We asked them how they feel about their long-term career prospects here in Hong Kong. 23% said that they are either good or quite good, and 45% said that they are either very bad or quite bad. So certainly a net negative view when you're asking people how they feel about their own long-term prospects here. So that's the statistical evidence, and it somewhat contradicts what my anecdotal evidence would suggest, but people are quite skeptical based on the data of their ability to pursue their long-term career prospects here in Hong Kong.
Right. I mean, Simon, does that open up opportunities for Singapore? I know you're joining us from Singapore. Do you see an influx of, especially perhaps Western businesses, but maybe even Hong Kongers coming to Singapore to do business there?
I think as far as Western businesses are concerned, there's no question there have been a couple of big name moves, like Deutsche Bank is one that everyone's written about. So yes, I think unfortunately the less well-off Hong Kong citizens are the one demographic that really can't do very much about this. They have to just basically suck it and see. And you know, I've been around long enough to have been here when Hong Kong was handed back to the Chinese. You know, Prince Charles came out here in the royal yacht and so on and so forth. And there was much wailing and gnashing of teeth. And indeed, many multinational businesses, including several of my clients, moved their regional headquarters from Hong Kong to Singapore in the expectation that things would rapidly go downhill in Hong Kong, and none of that actually happened. In fact, good many of them actually then moved back. I think one way to think about this in terms of where businesses are, if you are a serious global player in any form of financial service, can you afford not to be in the financial center of the world's second, or probably in due course, first size economy? Because that's the question. You're essentially saying, because Hong Kong will be to China what Frankfurt is to Germany. And at the end of the day, are you really, if you're a serious player, going to want to stand aloof from it? I don't think you are. And in fact, you didn't ask this question, but I think one of the biggest challenges for businesses like global banks who know they need to be in Hong Kong, they're going to be looking probably more to America than China. I don't think they're going to have any problem dealing with the requirement to self-censor. That's the way China operates. They don't want to haul people off to jail. They just want you not to get involved in their politics. That's all. And bankers, by and large, are quite happy to do that. They're going to be more worried that an aggressive American administration will decide that there need to be sanctions and that they cannot actually operate in Hong Kong and be in the rest of the world as well. I think that, to me, my banker friends are more worried about that than they are about the medium to long-term future of being in Hong Kong. Yeah.
Right. Now, listening to the two of you, it almost sounds like instead of asking, is the competition of tomorrow Hong Kong, Singapore, it almost sounds like I should be asking, is it Shanghai that should be worried because of the security law in Hong Kong? Because if this brings Hong Kong ever more firmly into the Chinese system, well, is it one country, one system, and Hong Kong is the center? Simon, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, again, an analogy might be the relationship of London with Europe in a post-Brexit Europe. At the end of the day, however much Europe may want to have its own financial ecosystem, the scale and experience that you have in London, whether it's legal, banking, experienced people at mid and low level, it just vastly dwarfs anywhere else in Europe. And trying to do that would be not just an incredibly difficult endeavor, but probably rather foolish. The same thing would be true, in fact, of Hong Kong. And partly the Chinese, it's difficult to know whether they've done this deliberately, but they should have opened up their financial services center. You've written about this, Salvatore. They should have opened up their financial services to the world when they acceded to the World Trade Organization, but they didn't. They didn't meet their obligations. One consequence of that is that they could have had much more expertise in Shanghai and Beijing. They haven't got it, because they didn't want foreign competition. You could say they're being very canny, and they always counted on, in effect, ring-fencing Hong Kong and bringing it into the fold, or you could say they just lucked out. But that's essentially how things would play out, yeah?
Daniel, you said you're seeing listings in Hong Kong from mainland companies. Are they choosing Hong Kong instead of Shanghai and Shenzhen? I mean, is that the shift that's really occurring?
I don't know if that's a shift. That's been the historical play for mainland companies. It really has always come down to a choice between either Hong Kong or the U.S. The U.S. typically has had one out on that. Now Hong Kong really has become far more attractive. But certainly Hong Kong remains an incredibly attractive place for companies from mainland China to hold their IPOs and to list. It is a far more accessible market for international investors, and therefore it affords mainland Chinese companies the opportunity to access the greater pools of international capital and, more importantly, institutional capital. So I completely agree with what Simon was saying, and I like the analogy between London and the rest of the EU. And I do think Hong Kong will maintain its financial strengths. I do think it's important to keep some things in perspective, which is, from a financial markets perspective, China is structurally very different in terms of the proportions of retail versus institutional capital, the forms of institutional capital and active management that are in China. But also, I just want to go back to some of the statistics that I referred to earlier. When we asked people in Hong Kong what their view was of Hong Kong's global competitiveness in certain industries, in finance, there was 44% of our survey respondents said Hong Kong is significantly better or somewhat better positioned competitively in the financial sector, versus only 22% who had said it was less well positioned. There were net negative findings that we had for law, which was surprising because there are a lot of lawyers in the city. But for some very important, what we would call new economy sectors, so e-commerce, biotech, and fintech. These are all areas where there is a tremendous amount of innovation taking place in mainland China. And certainly Hong Kong does not seem to be keeping pace from that perspective. In e-commerce, for example, only 25% of our respondents said that Hong Kong was globally competitive versus 34% saying it was not competitive. And in biotech, the numbers were even more, there was even greater disparity. Only 14% said that Hong Kong was competitive versus 52% saying it was not. So certainly it does seem to be a city where finance will continue to thrive, at least in the near term.
But Daniel, are we going to see a great replacement of expats like you who maybe are less comfortable with the security law and the human rights situation, and see innovative mainland Chinese moving in to take your places in Hong Kong?
The latter is definitely going to happen. There is an increasing number. It's that influx of mainland Chinese, very well educated, very fluent in English, has slowed down, unfortunately, because of coronavirus and just trouble getting across the border. But that has been a years-long trend, and once the borders open up, I expect it to resume. There's a cadre of expats like me who do feel uncomfortable in the new conditions here and are choosing to leave. Many going back to their home countries, again, just because for all that Singapore wants to compete to be a rival to Hong Kong, it doesn't have the same benefits, and is certainly very difficult for expats to find jobs there. But you do have a group of expats who want to hold on to Hong Kong and want to be part of its continued growth. They want to be part of that access to mainland China that Hong Kong can provide. So there will be a reserve of I won't be terribly lonely.
Well, I hope not. So, Simon, is Australia going to have any success in recruiting professionals from Hong Kong or across Asia to come work in Australia instead, to move their businesses here?
Well, you and I talked about this a little bit. They're certainly putting their best foot forward. The Prime Minister has appointed a special envoy who I think is still in Singapore because he can't actually get to Hong Kong. But we talked, I think, a week ago, and he has a very strong mandate to find wealthy Hong Kong individuals and also Hong Kong domiciled businesses who are worried about the political implications of greater proximity to China, and to encourage them to come to Australia. I suspect they'll be kind of the same people that Boris Johnson wants to come to London, because we're talking about the top 3%. The real challenge for Hong Kong is what happens to everybody else, and how are conditions going to change. I have to say I'm fairly positive about that. I don't think Hong Kong's materially changed for expats. That could be wrong. I haven't been there since February, obviously, for obvious reasons. Right. So you'd know better than me, Daniel, I guess.
Daniel, I'm curious not just about expats, but also about those less well-off people in Hong Kong who may have been very active in the protests against the security law and the protests for Hong Kong autonomy and democracy. Many of them now have a route to permanent residency in the United Kingdom and potential citizenship. Do you think they'll take it?
I think a certain amount will. Again, to Simon's point, I think that route really favors those of some means, some financial means, who can afford to relocate, and those that have some marketable skills. I think broadly there's a sense of resignation amongst people that these are the conditions in which they're going to live. But I think at this point, based on people's intentions, the UK seems to be the most likely destination, although we've yet to see what the aggregate numbers will show. For the average person here, I would say that relocating will be challenging, but some some certainly will try.
Right. Now, who is a competitor in Asia to Hong Kong as a business hub? I mean, let's say that the tightening of the screws as China asserts its control in Hong Kong does drive out businesses, does drive out stock market listings, does corrupt the rule of law in Hong Kong to such an extent that businesses simply can't operate there, Western businesses at least. Where would they go? Is Tokyo competitive? Seoul? Taipei? Singapore? Daniel, where would you bet? Where might your company move if you had to get out of Hong Kong?
Well, I think one city to keep in mind as a possible destination, in addition to those you've mentioned, is Shanghai.
Really?
Yes, yeah. At a certain point, companies might say, look, that there's actually greater certainty just moving to mainland China, setting up shop there. And we've actually seen that happen with one company, which is Vanguard, the large global asset management firm, which has shut down its business here and moved to Shanghai. It wasn't a result of and they're not a client. I can't speak for them. I can only tell you what my suppositions are. I think it's just because they've said, well, mainland China is ultimately where we want to be, and it's more advantageous for us to locate our business in Shanghai and try to tap the market from a local base, so to speak, local in the sense that it's within the same legal financial infrastructure. In terms of other markets that might be competitive, that's really hard to say. Taipei is a natural, but I think it will be difficult to attract talent there. And we've already heard anecdotally, again, stories of people from Hong Kong moving to Taipei and finding it less of a rougher transition than they would have expected. There are some language challenges. Cantonese is very different than Mandarin. The cost of living is lower, but also salaries are lower. Workplace standards are different. So I think talent will be a challenge. I think maybe some businesses might try Singapore, because that seems like a natural place. It's in the same time zone, but it's still not as advantageous as staying in Hong Kong. And Tokyo, we've heard a lot about, and some companies may try that, but I've yet to see anyone, or I've yet to hear anyone lay out a very convincing case for why that might be.
Right. Simon, any thoughts or any bets on where businesses might go? Or will we simply have companies going home, Japanese companies going to Japan, Singaporean ones going to Singapore, etc.?
Let me again go back a little bit in historical terms. When China opened up, and for the first time multinationals in the 1990s started putting substantial operations in China, including, for example, back office operations, which potentially exposed those multinationals to all kinds of issues, many companies, and it was very common to hear this at the time, talked about a China plus one policy, which is you've got to be in China, but there's a sufficiently high degree of risk of whatever nature that you're going to want to have redundancy, in effect, in your Asia Pacific headquarters, so that you can do a lot of other things somewhere else. I think that's a useful model and an instructive model. I think if you look at the candidates, Japan, because of the political, the stage of the political cycle in Japan, and because of the South China Sea issues and what is perceived as Chinese aggression, I make no observations on whether that's a correct perception, but it's hard to see, given the sort of rhetoric that's been flying backwards and forwards, because a lot of this does depend on the Chinese. The Chinese have to license a whole bunch of activities for a major financial center to operate in any material way in China, whether it's capital raising or the convertibility of the renminbi, whatever the hell it is. I think that, to be honest, Taipei is totally off the list because Taipei is a thorn in the side of China. They're not going to want to reward Taipei unless there's a very material political gain. I could just about see a more sympathetic pro-Chinese government in Taipei making that part of we'll commit to some kind of formula around a sort of 50-year becoming part of China. I can see that, but I can't see anything like that happening now. And I have to come back to what I see in Singapore. What I see is I see businesses coming to Singapore. I see that Singapore has managed, although it's going to be challenging going forward, has managed to maintain the perception of political neutrality. It still enjoys very good relationships with the United States. Most global financial institutions of any size are represented here. The rule of law, Chinese, 85% of the population are of Chinese origin, and it has a very warm relationship with China, going back right back to the days of Lee Kuan Yew, when he actually helped China partly figure out its relationship with the wider world. Then China was coming off having been very parochial and very enclosed. So I'm inclined to view Singapore as a very sensible bet. It is the same time zone, as Daniel said. It's also politically neutral, and I see less downside for both America and China. There are some big issues for Singapore, and the other issue, of course, you've got a massive amount of expertise already here. Something that Singapore's policy is very smart. You know, if you talk to them, and I've tried to talk to them a lot because I write articles about Singapore versus Hong Kong. It's a very common thing that journalists write about these days. They always say things like, well, you know, we value Hong Kong, we support Hong Kong, blah, 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 whilst quietly rubbing their hands every time an institution announces that it's moving to Hong Kong. I think Singapore, we're going to see a lot more growth in China-related activities in Singapore for all of the above reasons. Yeah.
Now, a lot of our viewers, frankly, are going to be unhappy to hear the plain truths that both of you are telling us, that businesses may actually be quite happy to see the quashing of protests in Hong Kong and, you know, peace and order restored so they can simply get on with the business of making money. But I want to ask you, and I'll start with Simon and then go to Daniel, what happens if China brings Hong Kong into the Chinese internet firewall? I mean, what happens if Hong Kong really becomes part of China in every sense, meaning that, you know, you can't even use Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, and who knows what other functionalities in Hong Kong. Will that change the calculus here? Simon?
Well, people said that about China. You know, when I first started, I mean, you know, I'm on the BBC a lot. When I first started going to China in the 90s, when internet was still dial-up, I could do reports from my hotel room. Now, about 5 years ago, even with a VPN, it became impossible to either listen to the BBC or to listen to CNN or to, you know, that hasn't really stopped inward investment in China. It hasn't really stopped economic activity. I mean, the notion that businesses, be they Western or anywhere else, you know, are operating according to a very narrowly defined set of frameworks which require certain levels of personal liberty, that's belied by the relationships that the world's biggest capitalist countries have had with all sorts of quite grubby regimes all over the world for 100 years. So I, you know, our press, which is broadly very left-wing in the West and certainly in Australia, likes to make a big meal out of this. I think businesses are going to quietly get on with it. After all, we are talking about an economy that will probably be the world's biggest economy within the next few decades. I know you and I disagree on the precise timing of this, Salvatore. You know, can you really afford not to be in that game? I mean, I wouldn't have thought so. Yeah.
Well, but Daniel, I mean, can you run you run a corporate communications firm? Can you run a corporate communications firm or any communications firm if you can't have encrypted communications because the apps are not allowed in Hong Kong?
I think to Simon's points, companies have been operating under those conditions in mainland China for quite some time. In terms of my own business and other businesses here, I think that's learn to adapt. I think it would be very psychologically discomforting if that were to happen. Certainly, I'm not an avid social media person, but I do think it would be very psychologically disturbing for a lot of people to see social media apps unavailable here, to see greater censorship of the media. For example, as Simon was saying, if you are in your hotel room in Shanghai and something controversial is displayed, then the screen goes to black. If that starts happening here in Hong Kong, I think that would be a significant psychological jolt to a lot of people, both expats and locals who have lived with these freedoms. But to Simon's point, I do think business marches on. Who's leading the business may change. It may be more of the mainland professionals that come in and start to become the local leaders of these businesses.
Right. So, I mean, let me then just push you a little on that. If you were to sketch out, what's Hong Kong going to look like in 10 years? Do you think it's going to be, Daniel, very much what it is today? Or, do you think major changes are on the horizon?
That's a difficult question. I do think major changes are on the horizon. I think they are inevitable, but it's hard to say exactly what they are. I think in the near term, let's say the next 3 to 5 years, maybe 5 to 7 years, conditions broadly remain the same. I think possibly the cost of business goes up for some companies. They do have to institute more legal and compliance functions. That has implications for their IT systems, has implications for just the cost of capital, getting money into and out of Hong Kong. That might increase, but I don't think anything dramatic happens in the near term that causes an exodus of either people or capital and businesses. But in the long term, significant change is inevitable, whether that's in 10 years or 20 years. It's probably a little bit further along the time horizon than 10 years. If you're asking specifically, does Hong Kong look in 10 years the way it looks today? It probably resembles it, and very much so. But there will be changes. It's just hard to see what they are.
Simon, do you concur?
Yeah, look, I'm never. It's very easy to be afraid of China if you spend too much time reading the Western press. China has an overwhelming interest. Overwhelming. What is China about? What has the change in China been about? It's been about economically emancipating a huge chunk of humanity. Whilst they have certain views of how they've been dispossessed and disrespected in the past, which they're trying to address, they certainly do not want to be in any kind of outright adversarial situation with any Western countries. What they want is peaceable growth on their terms. And I think a lot of the political points that are being made around things like social media and access to newspapers and all those kinds of things. My view on all of that, I've been in Singapore for nearly 30 years. You could argue that I've been kind of, conditioned. But at the end of the day, I don't see the social media in the West as particularly useful in keeping people accurately informed about what's going on. I see it as being immensely partisan and as having a very clearly biased political agenda of its own. If you look at what's allowed and what's not allowed, I find that a lot more terrifying than I find the fact that businesses might have to slightly trim what they allow on their emails if they want to work in China, right? They can't say President Xi needs to lose weight, or they can't call him Winnie the Pooh. Apparently that's no longer allowed, although it's surprisingly apt. Oops.
Well, for all of us, I have a question for Mark, which is if Hong Kong becomes the gateway for China to invest in the outside world, but what happens if its citizens want and expect more freedoms? Will people just have to accept the quid pro quo offered by China, behave yourself and you can prosper? That's the story we've been told about the mainland for years. Is that now going to be the story for Hong Kong? And Simon, if you want to give your thoughts on that, and then we'll go to Daniel.
It's very odd that there's a strange perception that Hong Kong were under the English and everything was fine and dandy, and all of a sudden they're being oppressed. I actually got asked on the BBC a couple of months ago, when Hong Kong had freedom, what was it like? And I said, well, when exactly was that? I mean, Hong Kong was wrested from the Chinese at the point of a gun when the British sank the entire Chinese Navy in less than 2 hours, enforced massive reparations on China, and compelled the Chinese to accept the forced addiction of huge chunks, tens of millions of people, to opium in order to offset their balance of payments deficit on the purchase of tea. That's the history of Hong Kong. So the Hong Kong people have never had freedom. They've had the ability to earn money relatively unimpeded, but they've never been politically emancipated. Hong Kong, up to and including Chris Patton, who's a lovely man, was ruled by a man who wore a hat with a feather in it and reported directly to the Queen. That's the history of Hong Kong. So the freedom never existed. I mean, there is a real issue, which is that if you look at the way that many people live in Hong Kong, cheap by jowl, incredibly expensive property, educational issues, health issues, there clearly is an emancipation question in the same way that question would be interpreted in mainland China. And I'm not sure that the Chinese model isn't actually better at addressing that than, say, the US model. I think that I see that the Chinese could have a significant positive influence on Hong Kong if they start to take on those things. Whether or not they will is another question. Yeah.
Well, but you're suggesting that China might learn from Hong Kong, but it looks entirely the other way from where I'm sitting, that China's imposing its view on Hong Kong. Is that not the case?
I think, I'm not known for my sympathetic views to the protests in Hong Kong, simply because I've been in this region for 30 years and I've traveled and worked in pretty well every major capital in the region. There is no question but that Hong Kong has always enjoyed a significant level of personal and economic freedom. To claim that Hong Kong in any material way is oppressed, even now, is ludicrous when you compare it with the lives that people live in much of Asia. That's simply a fact, if you actually bother to go out and look. So, are there questions? Yes, there are. Are we looking at, we're looking at a China that's concerned that Hong Kong does not become a virus, in the metaphorical sense, which infects China, because China is obsessed above all by continuity and by political, by stability. And that's a big worry, and that's why they're doing the things that they're doing now.
Daniel, is Hong Kong being offered the same quid pro quo that has applied in China for 40 years?
I think it is, and I don't think that's anything new. I just think that it's become a more urgent question that people have to grapple with. Are we comfortable with that with that quid pro quo? I think my sense is that most people are just putting off answering that question and having to reckon with it right now, because on an everyday basis, very little has changed. And certainly, it's much easier for people to attribute some of the hardships that they face, as Simon was enumerating. The cost of living here, difficult access to good quality public education, some of the other economic hardships that people face here. I think it's easier to chalk those up to macroeconomic conditions or the administration here, the administration of daily life in Hong Kong. Certainly those more pressing issues have existed for some time, but I think what we have seen in some of the changes that have taken place is that the question of whether people will accept that quid pro quo is becoming more urgent, and that's quite frankly what seems to be on the table right now from mainland China.
Right. And Daniel, let me follow up. Zach says that his Hong Kong friends often say that Shanghai has been designated by the Chinese government as a replacement for Hong Kong. In the end, is this security law and what's going on in Hong Kong really just an effort by the Communist Party and the central government in China to promote Shanghai?
Well, it's hard for me to start to try to read into the minds of the technocrats in Beijing about which area they want to favor. What I see when I look at the landscape, whether it's Shanghai or Shenzhen or now the Greater Bay Area in southern China, I believe that the Chinese are trying to promote various economic models within the mainland system, and some of which this Greater Bay Area, which does include Hong Kong. So I'm not sure that it's designed to rival Hong Kong entirely or provide a clear alternative, but I just think that the Chinese government is following the same approach that they have in the past, which is let's try various forms of economic experimentation, some of which may pose existential challenges to Hong Kong, some of which may provide a role for Hong Kong. So I don't think it's as cut and dry as the question makes it out to be.
Now I have a question for both of you. Richard has kindly asked me to ask you if you have read a fantastic book called American Tianxia, Chinese Money, American Power, and the End of History, by yours truly. I didn't set this up, but I am curious if you have any thoughts on the American role in China and in Hong Kong?
You know I've read it, Pat Salvatore, because you sent me a copy. Not only have I read it, but my 89-year-old mother has read it. And in fact, we should have invited her to this call because she's very opinionated on America and China.
Daniel, any thoughts on America, China?
Specifically the book or the relationship?
Either way, yes.
I think that's unfortunately, I mean, I do have the book and I have read it and I thought it was a great read. The relationship, though, that I see between the United States and China, at least from a commercial perspective, is that companies still want to do business here. Simon was saying it is just too large to ignore. What's been interesting is, again, I may be coming at this from very much a capital markets perspective, but you do hear people talking about investment strategies that were in the past they would be Asia Pacific ex Japan. Now they are Asia Pacific ex China because China just dominates so much of the region economically. If you are allocating capital to this market, China is entirely its own strategy in and of itself. I just think it's too large of a market for companies to ignore. Certainly, that's what I see from my clients, and that's what I see from just my daily interaction with people. Is that the business communities will continue to find space within which they can continue to work with each other, and hopefully, politics will interfere only at the margins.
Right. Now we have a shout out to both of you from Andy, Tim, Christina, Zach, all complimenting you for your insights. So thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Simon. Daniel, we know that the U.S. election is coming up in just a few weeks. We don't need to know who you plan to vote for, but what do you think the implications are for the current situation on human rights in Hong Kong?
Well, I will say in terms of whom I plan to vote for, I've already voted. I won't tell you for whom I voted in. But
may your ballot be red.
Yes, let's hope so. To be perfectly honest with you, I don't see very much changing, almost in any regard, with the exception that I think that there will be a certain, perhaps, diplomatic normalization if there is a Biden victory. I think that it's just that he's much more of a traditionalist from many perspectives, certainly from a diplomatic perspective. But I don't see dramatic changes in the way that the U.S. approaches human rights, and I don't see dramatic changes in economic policy, except perhaps a bit of a normalization in the way that the U.S. approaches its grievances with China. Certainly, no one I know is expecting things to change dramatically.
Really?
What overwhelmingly what people say is we just want. And this is somewhat disappointing that we're talking about this with regard to the United States, is they just want a quick, smooth transition so that the world can get on with things.
Right. Simon, any thoughts on the U.S. election and implications for this situation?
There's never been, if you look at the political situation in the U.S., it doesn't really matter which of the two main parties you're talking about. There's never really been a smooth and definable relationship with Asia. When Obama talked about a pivot to Asia, that was a massive insult to Asia. It was like, oh, goodness me, it's hurting me. Asia exists. What should I be doing about it? I mean, what that displayed to those of us who are here was just a massive parochialism. And, I think Trump is also clumsy, but in a different way. I think the good news is that most people that have been here, and certainly most senior American businessmen that I know, and I know a lot, being long in the tooth, I know people who run companies and who speak Chinese and who live here, they basically separate the commercial relationships on which they depend from the political noise. And the Chinese, who 25 years ago got very upset at political rhetoric in the US, are now pretty sophisticated, and they now understand that there's an awful lot of argy-bargy and hot air, and at the end of the day, most things will continue in the same way. I personally think a second Trump term, which of course we're about to enjoy, is likely to see a bit of a slackening off, because there's much less upside for Trump in a second term when he can't get a third term. So you'll be looking for, you can expect him to deliver rapprochement, growth, call out diplomatic achievements, and I would in many ways prefer that to a new term with a new party. Yeah.
Daniel, the coronavirus has been used as a tool, I think it's fair to say, by democracy activists in Hong Kong to try to put some distance between themselves and China. Do you think that strategy is likely to continue, or are things going to start moving much more rapidly towards integration once the coronavirus pandemic has passed?
I don't know to what extent it's been so much of a strategy for democracy activists here, but to the extent that they've tried to exploit coronavirus conditions, I think that would be, any effectiveness of that strategy would be quite ephemeral. I think that would be, especially because China has been, from what we can tell, extremely successful in quelling its own coronavirus issues by various means. And the situation here in Hong Kong from a coronavirus perspective is not dire. Everyone is anxious for the borders to open again. And so I think any effectiveness of that strategy is really has a very distinct time horizon.
Right. Simon, is the coronavirus situation one of the factors that has been preventing the shift of individuals and businesses from Hong Kong to Singapore? Do you think that floodgates might open once the epidemic has passed?
Well, I think there are a lot of people like me who are going to be getting on airplanes. I'm not going to be in so much of a hurry to see President Xi. I'm more interested in seeing my 90-year-old mum and my kids, both of whom are stuck in the city of London. What have we got? 7 months, I guess. I think the basic trajectory continues. I think the role of Hong Kong, and it's not answering your question, but it's something I did want to add, and I know we're running out of time. If you look at the amendment to the Chinese constitution that was created when China opened up, it's amazing because the Chinese are very open about what they set out to do. What they set out to do was to invite Western expertise into China, to create overcapacity, and then to benefit from those capabilities, both infrastructural and capital investment and intellectual knowledge. Now, one industry where they haven't done that is financial services, because they've been terrified. The clout of London and New York would essentially run away with financial services in China, because financial services are incredibly clunky. They're 50 years behind in insurance and assurance and pension funds and all those sorts of things. Hong Kong provides them with an ideal opportunity to essentially take from Hong Kong what they want and use it to incubate it in different parts of the economy in China in a way that they can manage and control. So yes, over time, a lot of the things that are going on in Hong Kong will go on in China. But I don't think Shanghai is going to become the Chinese financial center, because why? At the end of the day, inevitably, China is going to absorb Hong Kong hook, line, and sinker, and Hong Kong has too much value and too much accumulated expertise for them to squander that. Why would they? Yeah.
We do have one question from Max about Alan Tudge, our population minister and Australia's federal government's global business and talent attraction force. We've already addressed this, but I have to come back to this question. Do you think Australia has any chance, we'll start with Simon, any chance of leveraging the Hong Kong situation to its advantage at all, or is this just a non-issue for people in Asia? Is anyone thinking about Australia?
Sure. I mean, lots of us like Australia. I mean, the question is, and I did say this to the gentleman from Australia, maybe he's on the call, I don't know, is he? I said it would help if you weren't so ruthlessly demonizing Chinese all over the media and politically in Australia, because these two strategies run directly counter to one another. So the only way you're going to persuade honkies that Australia is a good place for them is to somehow differentiate the rhetoric about mainland China from the rhetoric about Hong Kong. Nice if you can do it, but not easy, I don't think.
Really? So are people confusing that message? Because, of course, the message here in Australia is consistently Chinese Australians and Chinese people are very welcome, but the Communist Party of China is not. Is that message not getting out in Asia?
I thought, I thought I read something about, how the Chinese were taking over the universities and using it to spread dissension and to recruit spies and I don't know what. I mean, one has to be careful how much one attaches to stuff one reads in the media. But certainly I've read a lot of negative rhetoric, and certainly in New Zealand and Australia, discussions about whether the purchase of land and assets to buy or spy by Chinese should be limited and things like that. People notice those sorts of things, And certainly in considering where I want to take my company and my wealth to, if I'm a wealthy Hong Kong Chinese, I might well consider going somewhere else,
Daniel, we're just about running out of time, so can I ask a question that was specifically addressed to you from our viewer, Luke? He asks, as the U.S.-China rivalry rages on and looks more and more likely to be a long-term fixture of international affairs, what potential changes do you see to Hong Kong's role in relation to China?
My view is that there will be even tighter integration between Hong Kong and China. I think, quite frankly, the relationship with China is what gives Hong Kong its strength and competitive advantages. So the local market seems to want to double down on that relationship and those advantages. It becomes a question of this is in my view, it becomes a question of who's leading Hong Kong in that direction. Is it increasingly talent from mainland China that is coming here and taking not just junior level positions, but management level positions of institutions here? That may be the case. Putting this into the context of U.S.-China relations, quite frankly, it looks like the U.S. right now under the current administration, the State Department is happy to put sanctions on Hong Kong that could have a deleterious effect to the people it is purportedly acting in support of, which is the local Hong Kong community. Quite frankly, Hong Kong may may endure some collateral damage, as part of that trade war. But I don't think that it poses an existential threat to Hong Kong at this point.
Right. Now we're about to wrap up. I do have one final viewer question, and then I have a final question of my own. Final viewer question from Mark is, what would be your advice? And we'll start with Daniel, and then we can get to Simon. Daniel, what would be your advice to a potential expat? And we're talking here a senior financial services guy with school-age children contemplating a move to Hong Kong. Do you think it's safe?
I'm actually trying to persuade a colleague now to make just that choice. In terms of safety, yes, I do. I don't think for the average expat, life has become all that much more politically fraught or legally fraught, let's say. Quite frankly, some of the greatest challenges that existed before, things like the national security law, still exist, and that's finding a good place to put your kids, dealing with the cost of living here, but the question is, what is the role for an expat in Hong Kong? Because the roles for people like me are diminishing, quite frankly. So the bigger concern is, for how long do people like me remain relevant as Hong Kong continues to change?
Really? Simon, what are your thoughts? Is Hong Kong still a good place for expats to go?
Well, I guess as a governor of a Catholic boarding school here in Southeast Asia, perhaps I should argue very strongly that you all join the church and come down here. But I won't do that, because I know that's non-PC. All I would say is, look, the vast majority of people in Hong Kong are not rebelling against an oppressive China. That whole thing was massively blown up. Of course there are grievances, and of course there's uncertainty over the future trajectory.
Well, we did see several million people marching. I mean, that's a substantial fraction of the population of Hong Kong.
Well, let's talk about the numbers later, Salvatore. I'm not sure whether I agree with that. But at the end of the day, Hong Kong is stable. It will remain stable. It's overwhelmingly in the interests of China for it to continue to be stable. I have many expat friends who live there for years and who continue to live there with the very greatest of confidence. I would have no hesitation in saying, by all means, put down roots in Hong Kong, educate your children in Hong Kong. There's many good schools there. I don't think it's in anyone's interest to burn down Hong Kong. And in many ways, I worry more about political missteps by the US and China as we go through election cycles and things are ramped up on both sides. Particularly when I see aircraft carriers steaming up and down the South China Sea rather unnecessarily. So barring major accidents, and of course they may occur, I think Hong Kong is a very good bet. Yeah.
Right. Now, I want to follow up with a question about China proper, PRC, mainland China. I talked to the American consulate here in Sydney about the safety of traveling in China. They said that, as far as they're aware, there are no sole U.S. citizens who have been unfairly imprisoned or imprisoned without charges in China. No serious problem situations. However, we know there are 2 Canadian business people in prison under very harsh conditions with questionable charges against them. We've seen Australian journalists have to flee China in the middle of the night. People who are not Americans seem to me to face a lot more of a challenge in China. That is, China seems to be more afraid of retaliation from the United States, but it doesn't fear retaliation from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, European countries. Is it safe for non-Americans to do business in China? Simon?
Well, look, I've gone up to China many times with a crew and wandered about filming stuff and talking about things and never had a problem in hotels, in companies, in the street. I think there are certain things that you can do and say, particularly if you use social media, that are going to bring you to the attention of the Chinese authorities, as there are in Singapore, as there are in much of the world. I think if what you're there for is primarily an economic relationship, then I think you should bear in mind that as a guest, you should behave like a guest. It is not an oppressive experience to go live in Shanghai or Tianjin or Beijing or anywhere in China, and I know I spent many months living in all of those places. So I think we should put aside this notion that everyone's being surveyed and is under imminent danger of arrest, because that just isn't the reality for those of us that know China and have worked there.
But the Canadian business people in prison, they're just political pawns. They weren't doing anything untoward in China.
Of course, there's a lot going on over Huawei as well over that, so I think that's a bit of a tangled web. I agree it's unfortunate, but I wouldn't make any massive inferences about the overall safety of China from that case.
Daniel, does it matter to you and the people you're recruiting, whether they're Americans or people from countries that perhaps can't defend their citizens quite as well?
I think it does. I think there are concerns. I agree with Simon that the concerns may be overblown, but certainly it is something that people are thinking about, talking about when they are considering travel to mainland China. But it's really hard to say right now because it hasn't been possible. It hasn't been possible for so long. But it has been a topic of conversation earlier on when travel was possible. There were a lot of concerns that people expressed. Again, they may have been somewhat overblown. As Simon was saying, these are just 2 incidences. But it's certainly, I do think that there is reason to be concerned about them. I don't want to make light of those 2 Canadians who are still being held. But I do think that there are reasons to be concerned, but I wouldn't let it hold me back from traveling.
Really? Well, Simon Littlewood, Daniel Del Rey, thank you so much for joining us today. Much appreciated.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Salvatore. Nice to meet you,
Thank
Daniel.
You for inviting me. Likewise, Simon.
Our pleasure. Thanks also to our viewers. I'm Salvatore Babones, talking to you from the Center for Independent Studies. For decades, the Center for Independent Studies has been a fiercely independent voice, working hard to deliver evidence-based policy. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, click the notification bell if you're watching on YouTube. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our cause. So please check out the links on screen to see how you can get involved. Thanks for watching.